"Please don't fire me," the timid janitor begged. The businessman laughed but was shocked when Richard Parker was at the peak of his rage when he found the janitor in the hallway on the 20th floor of his corporate building in New York City. The 52-year-old man had built a million-dollar empire based on quick decisions and a firm hand, and he didn't tolerate employees who didn't meet his expectations. The janitor knelt before him, his hands trembling as he begged through tears not to be fired. The worn blue uniform was dirty from the morning's work, and his red eyes showed sleepless nights. Richard laughed loudly, finding the scene unfolding before his executives pathetic. "Please, Mr. Parker, I need this job," sobbed the 30-year-old man, who could barely lift his gaze from the marble floor. "My mother is very sick, and I'm all she has." The executives around them whispered awkwardly, but Richard only increased the volume of his cruel laughter. He loved demonstrating power, especially in front of witnesses. The veteran secretary, Mrs. Wilson, who had worked at the company for 15 years, tried to intervene with a pleading look, but was silenced by an authoritative gesture from the boss. "Should have thought of that before arriving late for the third time this month, shouldn't you?" said Richard, adjusting his Italian silk tie. "This company is no place for losers." The janitor, named Kevin, raised his face for the first time, revealing tired but dignified features. He lived on the other side of the city, in the outskirts of Queens, and had to take 4 buses to get to work in the center. He left home at 4 in the morning every day, but even so, sometimes he was late because of the chaotic traffic of the city. "Sir, I do everything to arrive on time," explained Kevin, his voice choked. "But my mother has dementia, and sometimes she gets lost during the night. I have to look for her before coming to work." The revelation made some employees emotional, but Richard remained impassive. In fact, the mention of the sick mother only irritated him more. He had grown up without showing weakness and didn't tolerate when others displayed it publicly. "Personal problems are no excuse for professional incompetence," declared Richard, walking in circles around the kneeling janitor. "If you can't fulfill your obligations, you should look for another job." Kevin then did something desperate. He took a crumpled and yellowed photo from his shirt pocket, extending it to Richard with trembling hands. The image showed a middle-aged woman smiling next to a hospital bed, appearing frail, which contrasted with the sweetness in her eyes. "This is my mother, sir. She raised me alone after my father abandoned us, worked her whole life as a housekeeper to give me an education," said Kevin, his voice breaking. "Now she doesn't recognize me anymore, but I can't abandon her." The photo provoked even crueler laughter from Richard, who took it and examined it with disdain. The tension in the hallway increased when the head of Human Resources, Dr. Thompson, whispered something about possible labor lawsuits, making Richard hesitate momentarily. "Mr. Parker," Dr. Thompson discreetly intervened, "perhaps we should consider a transfer to another department or a formal warning instead of immediate dismissal." Richard completely ignored him. His attention was focused on the humiliation he could inflict before all present. It was a demonstration of power that fed his bruised ego from a childhood where he himself had felt powerless. Kevin then confessed that he slept only 3 hours a night because he cared for his mother alone after work. He took her to medical appointments, bathed her, fed her, and tried to keep the house in order. He worked as a janitor during the day and took side jobs as a night watchman on weekends to pay for the medications that Medicaid didn't cover. The revelation made Mrs. Wilson visibly emotional, discreetly wiping tears with an embroidered handkerchief. She herself had cared for her elderly mother for many years and knew the weight of that responsibility. Other employees also showed growing discomfort with the cruelty of the situation. "Enough theatrics," Richard interrupted abruptly. "Security. Escort this man out of the building immediately." That's when Kevin, in absolute despair, shouted a phrase that froze everyone in the hallway as if lightning had struck the building. "Richie. Remember Richie, who used to play hide-and-seek in the garden?" The silence that followed was deafening. Richard instantly paled, as if he had seen a ghost. His legs faltered, and he had to lean against the glass wall to keep from falling. That nickname. No one had called him that in over 40 years. What did you say?" whispered Richard, his voice losing all its former authority. Kevin slowly stood up, wiping tears from his face. His eyes, once submissive, now shone with a mix of pain and determination. He studied the businessman's face, searching for traces of the boy his mother had loved so much. "Richie," repeated Kevin more softly this time, "the boy my mother raised as if he were her own son. The boy she soothed when he had nightmares and made raindrop cookies for every Thursday." The entire hallway was in shock. The executives glanced at each other, not understanding what was happening, while Mrs. Wilson brought her hand to her chest, her eyes wide with surprise. Richard felt the world spinning around him. Memories flooded his mind like a breaking dam. The smell of cinnamon from the kitchen, caring hands combing his hair, a sweet voice singing lullabies, the comforting lap where he found solace after his father's harsh scoldings. "Mrs. Mitchell," murmured Richard, more to himself than to others. "Your mother is Mrs. Mitchell?" Kevin nodded, watching the transformation taking place on the businessman's face. The arrogance had completely disappeared, replaced by a vulnerability Richard hadn't shown in decades. "She still talks about you," said Kevin, his voice now firmer. "Even with dementia, even without remembering her own name sometimes, she still remembers Richie. Says you were the sweetest boy in the world. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing." Tears began to stream down Richard's face, who hadn't cried in front of anyone in over 20 years. He remembered Mrs. Mitchell perfectly, the woman who had practically raised him while his parents traveled constantly for business. She arrived early in the morning and only left when he was already asleep. "Shouldn't she have been working for my family?" asked Richard, confused, trying to organize his jumbled memories. Kevin shook his head, a sad smile crossing his face. It was time to tell the truth his mother had kept for so long to avoid hurting the memories of the boy she loved so much. "My father dismissed her when he found out she was pregnant with me," explained Kevin, each word cutting through the air like a blade. "He said he didn't want a maid with a small child getting in the way of work. She was sent away without any severance, 6 months pregnant." The shock hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. He vaguely remembered a day when Mrs. Mitchell simply never showed up again. "Your parents said she had found something better and forbade any mention of her name. He was only 10 years old and cried for weeks, not understanding why his second mother had disappeared." "Daddy lied to me," whispered Richard, the puzzle pieces finally falling into place. "He said she didn't want to work for us anymore." Mrs. Wilson, who had known the family for decades, confirmed the story with a silent nod. She remembered the rumors at the time of how Mr. Parker Sr. had been cruel to the pregnant maid. But back then, she was too young to question the employer's decisions. Kevin continued his revelation, each word weighing tons on the businessman's heart. Mrs. Mitchell had spent her entire pregnancy working as a house cleaner, off the books, accepting any job to survive. She had given birth in a crowded public hospital alone, without the baby's father who had promised marriage and then disappeared. "She raised me alone," Kevin continued, "worked 7 days a week to give me an education. Never complained, never spoke ill of your family. On the contrary, she always said you were a special child, that you had a good heart." Richard remembered how Mrs. Mitchell defended him from his authoritarian father's criticisms. When he broke something or got bad grades, she always found a way to soften the situation. She was the one who comforted him after harsh punishments, who gave him affection when his parents were too busy to notice his existence. Where is she now?" asked Richard, fearing the answer. Kevin sighed deeply before answering. His mother was admitted to Metropolitan Hospital in the public sector, awaiting surgery that could improve her quality of life. But the waiting list was long, and without private health insurance she would probably die before being properly treated. "That's why I work 3 jobs," confessed Kevin. "In the morning here as a janitor. In the afternoon I load merchandise at the wholesale market, and at night I watch over a parking lot in Chinatown, all to pay for her medications and try to get private insurance for her." The irony of the situation was devastating for Richard. The man who had built a $1 million empire owed his emotional sanity in childhood to that woman who was now abandoned in a public hospital. Guilt and shame overwhelmed him in a way he had never experienced. Why didn't you come to me before?" asked Richard, genuinely confused. Kevin explained that he had discovered where Richard worked only a year ago through a business magazine article showing New York City's most successful businessmen. He immediately recognized the face, even after so many years. It took months to gather the courage to apply for a position at the company. "I didn't want anything from you," said Kevin with dignity. "I just needed an honest job. My mother always taught me to earn things through my own effort." Richard remembered Mrs. Mitchell always repeating the same phrase, "Work dignifies a man, my son. Never ask for anything you can't earn with your own hands." She had taught Kevin the same values she had tried to teach him as a child. "Does she know you work here?" asked Richard. Kevin shook his head no. Mrs. Mitchell didn't even know where he worked. With advanced dementia, she lived mostly in the past, confusing times and people. Sometimes she called him Richie, imagining he was the boy she had raised decades ago. "Sometimes she asks me if you're okay," revealed Kevin, watching the impact of his words on the businessman. "Even without remembering exactly who I am, she still worries about you." Dr. Thompson, who had silently followed the entire conversation, finally spoke up. As head of human resources, he knew the company's history well and remembered some long-time employees who mentioned the former housekeeper for the Parker family. "Mr. Richard," said Dr. Thompson carefully, "Mrs. Mitchell worked for your family for over 8 years. According to our old records, she never had a single complaint." Mrs. Wilson discreetly approached and whispered something that made Richard turn even paler. She remembered seeing Mrs. Mitchell a few times at the public hospital when she took her own mother to appointments. The woman always asked about him, wanting to know if he was well, if he had married, if he was happy. "She kept all your childhood photos," continued Kevin, pulling an old worn wallet from his pocket. "Even when she sold almost everything we had during hard times, she never got rid of your pictures." Richard took the wallet with trembling hands and opened it. There were photos of him from ages 5 to 10, blowing out birthday candles, playing in the garden, sleeping on the sofa. In all of them, Mrs. Mitchell appeared in the background or at his side, always smiling, always caring. One photo in particular struck him like lightning. It was him at 7 years old, with a broken arm, being comforted by Mrs. Mitchell at the hospital. He had fallen off his bicycle, and she had run faster than his own parents to help him. It was she who stayed by his side during the surgery, who slept in the uncomfortable hospital chair. "I remember this," whispered Richard, touching the photo with reverence. "She sang to me all night because I was scared." Kevin smiled for the first time since the conversation began. His mother had told that story hundreds of times, always with the same maternal affection. It was one of her most precious memories of the boy she had helped raise. "She said you were too brave for your age," Kevin shared. "That you tried to be too strong for a little boy. She worried you would grow up without learning to ask for help when you needed it." The words echoed in Richard's mind like a fulfilled prophecy. He had indeed grown up without learning to ask for help, building emotional walls that isolated him from any vulnerability. The toughness he developed to survive in the business world had become his only way of being. "Doctor," Thompson discreetly approached and whispered in Richard's ear that other employees were beginning to gather in the hallway, drawn by the commotion. It would be better to continue the conversation in a more private location. "Kevin," said Richard, his voice still trembling but regaining some firmness, "would you come with me to my office? We need to talk more calmly." Kevin hesitated for a moment, unsure if he could trust the businessman's sudden change in behavior. But something in Richard's eyes told him that the kind boy his mother had raised still existed somewhere beneath all that corporate armor. Richard's office occupied the entire corner of the 20th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of New York City. Kevin had never been in such a luxurious place, but he refused to be intimidated. Mrs. Mitchell had taught him that a person's worth wasn't measured by what they owned. Richard served water to Kevin and sat in the armchair facing him, abandoning his imposing desk. It was a symbolic gesture, placing himself on the same level as the janitor he had humiliated moments before. "Tell me about her," requested Richard. "Tell me everything about Mrs. Mitchell." Kevin began to narrate his mother's life after leaving the Parker household. The first years had been the hardest, working as a house cleaner without proper papers, earning very little, and spending almost everything on daycare and doctors. But she always maintained her dignity and faith that better days would come. She always said that honest work was rewarded, Kevin told. Even when we only had rice and beans to eat, she was thankful to have food on the table. Richard Parker remembered the same life philosophy that Mrs. Mitchell had tried to teach him as a child. She spoke about gratitude, humility, and the importance of helping the less fortunate. Lessons he had completely forgotten over the years. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. When you were about 12, Kevin went on, she got a steady job at a department store. It was our salvation. Finally, we had a signed work card, meal vouchers, basic health insurance. Richard Parker mentally calculated that his family had let Mrs. Mitchell go exactly when she needed stability the most. The guilt weighed on his chest like a giant rock. He tried to remember asking his parents about her, but the memories were hazy. She worked at the store for 15 years, Kevin continued. Always an exemplary employee, never missed a single day. Helped me finish high school and even tried to convince me to go to college. Kevin explained that he had tried to study business at a private college, but had to drop out in the second semester when his mother started showing the first signs of dementia. The money that was used for tuition had to be redirected to doctors and medication. She was devastated when she found out I had dropped out of college, Kevin revealed, a tear running down his face. She said she had failed me, that she should have saved more money. Richard Parker felt his heart break. Mrs. Mitchell had always valued education above all else. She could barely read and write, but she dreamed that the children she cared for could have all the opportunities she never had. How did the symptoms start? Richard Parker asked, fearing the answer. Kevin said that at first it was small forgetfulness, pots on the stove, lost keys, missed appointments. Then came confusion with dates, trouble recognizing familiar places, and finally the gradual loss of recent memory. The worst was when she stopped recognizing me, Kevin said, his voice breaking. For months she treated me like a stranger. She asked who I was, what I was doing in her house, when I was leaving. Richard Parker imagined Kevin's suffering, taking care alone of a mother who no longer recognized him. He himself could barely handle basic household matters, having always had staff to take care of his personal problems. But there are good days, Kevin continued with a weak smile. Sometimes she wakes up lucid, calls me by my name, asks about my life, and she almost always asks about you. If you're well, if you're happy, if you started a family. The revelation touched Richard Parker deeply. Even sick, even abandoned, Mrs. Mitchell still worried about the boy she had raised with so much love. That woman's loyalty and unconditional love were greater than any hurt or resentment. She never said a bad word about your family, Kevin added. I asked several times why you had sent her away, but she always changed the subject, said it wasn't important to look back. Richard Parker stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city he had conquered, but which now seemed small in the face of the enormity of his guilt. He had built an empire, but had lost his humanity in the process. Kevin, said Richard Parker, turning to face the superintendent, I need to see her. I need to talk to Mrs. Mitchell. Kevin hesitated. His mother's condition was very fragile, and he didn't know how she would react to seeing Richard Parker after so many years. The dementia made her live mostly in the past, and meeting the adult, Richie might confuse her even more. She might not recognize you, Kevin warned, or she might confuse you with other people. The disease is very cruel, Mr. Parker, Richard insisted. It didn't matter if she recognized him or not. He needed to see her. He needed to ask for forgiveness for abandoning her. He needed to honor the memory of the woman who had been more of a mother to him than his own biological mother. Dr. Thompson knocked softly on the door and entered with a folder of documents. Richard instructed him to cancel all the day's meetings and prepare the car. They would go to the hospital immediately. Sir, said Dr. Thompson carefully, perhaps it would be best to call the hospital first, check on the patient's condition. Richard interrupted him with a gesture. There was no time to lose. Mrs. Mitchell had waited too long for him. He wouldn't let her wait another minute. Kevin offered to guide them to the hospital, but first made a revelation that shocked Richard even more. Mrs. Mitchell wasn't just hospitalized for observation. Her condition had deteriorated drastically in the last week, and the doctors were not optimistic about the prognosis. "She may not have much time," said Kevin, tears welling up in his eyes again. "The doctors said it's a matter of days, maybe weeks." The urgency hit Richard like a slap in the face. He had just found his adoptive mother, only to discover he might lose her forever in a matter of days. The cruel irony of fate was almost unbearable. In the elevator going down to the garage, Kevin shared more details about the hospitalization. Mrs. Mitchell had fainted at home 3 days ago and hadn't fully regained consciousness since. She drifted in and out of states of lucidity, sometimes recognizing Kevin, sometimes lost in memories of decades past. "Yesterday, she spent the whole afternoon talking about you," revealed Kevin, telling the nurses about the boy she used to care for. "They thought it was delirium, but I knew she was remembering for real." Richard's car, a silver Mercedes sedan, glided through the chaotic traffic of New York City. Kevin felt uncomfortable in the luxurious leather seat, but Richard seemed oblivious to the social contrast evident at every traffic light. "How did you get the janitor position at my company?" Richard asked during the drive. Kevin explained that he had seen the job posting on the company website and decided to apply using a slightly different name on his resume. He didn't want his connection to Mrs. Mitchell to influence the hiring decision in any way. "I wanted to get the job on my own merit," said Kevin. "My mother always taught me to earn things with honesty and hard work." Richard recognized Mrs. Mitchell's lessons in every word Kevin spoke. It was impossible not to see the influence of the upbringing she had given her son in the dignified way he handled life's adversities. Metropolitan Hospital was crowded as always. Kevin guided Richard through the overcrowded hallways, past gurneys in the corridor, worried families and overburdened healthcare professionals. The contrast with the private hospitals Richard knew was shocking. "She's in the geriatric ward," Kevin explained, stopping before a door that led to a hall with about 20 beds. "There's no private room, but the nurses are very attentive." Richard followed Kevin between the beds, observing other elderly people in states similar to Mrs. Mitchell's. The reality of the public healthcare system hit him with a force he had never experienced before. Those people were there not by choice, but for lack of options. Mrs. Mitchell was in bed number 17 near the window. Richard barely recognized her at first. The strong, vibrant woman from his memories had transformed into a fragile lady, with sparse white hair and a face marked by illness. But when she opened her eyes and smiled upon seeing Kevin, Richard immediately recognized the familiar glimmer of kindness. "My boy," whispered Mrs. Mitchell, extending a trembling hand toward Kevin. "You came to see me." Kevin held his mother's hand affectionately and leaned in to kiss her forehead. Then carefully, he turned to Richard and made the introduction that would change everything. "Mom," Kevin said softly, "there's someone here who wants to see you, someone you've known for a long time." Mrs. Mitchell turned her eyes toward Richard, and for a moment she seemed confused. She studied the businessman's face, searching for something familiar among the lines of expression and the signs of age. And then the miracle happened. "Richie?" she whispered, her eyes lighting up with sudden clarity. "My Richie?" Richard approached the bed with tears in his eyes. He knelt beside Mrs. Mitchell and held her free hand, feeling how cold and fragile it was, yet still capable of conveying the same unconditional love from decades past. "It's me, Mrs. Mitchell," said Richard, his voice breaking. "Your Richie has grown up." Mrs. Mitchell smiled with a sweetness that made Richard remember all those Saturday mornings when she made special pancakes for him. Her hands, though trembling, caressed the businessman's face just as they had when he was a child and had hurt his knee playing in the garden. "You look so handsome," she said, her words slow but clear. "So elegant. I always knew you would be someone important." Tears now streamed freely down Richard's face. All his business toughness had vanished, replaced by the vulnerability of a boy reuniting with his second mother after decades apart. "Mrs. Mitchell," said Richard, kissing her hand, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything my family did to you." for abandoning you when you needed us most." Mrs. Mitchell shook her head weakly, a sad but understanding smile crossing her face. Even in illness, even in her final moments, she held no grudges. The love she felt for the boy she had raised was greater than any resentment. "Don't speak of that, my son," she whispered. "The past is the past. What matters is that you're here now." Kevin watched the scene with a mix of emotion and relief. He had dreamed of this moment for years, imagining what it would be like if Richie and his mother were reunited. The reality exceeded all expectations. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. "Mom," said Kevin, sitting in the chair beside the bed. "Richie is my boss now. I work at his company." Mrs. Mitchell seemed to process the information slowly, her eyes moving from one to the other. A smile of satisfaction formed on her lips, as if fate had finally set things right the way they were meant to be. "The two of you together," she murmured. "My two boys together. It's all a mother could want." The phrase struck Richard at the core of his heart. Mrs. Mitchell saw them as brothers, united by the love she had dedicated to both. Kevin was the son by blood, but Richard was the son of her heart, and she loved them both with the same maternal intensity. "Mrs. Mitchell," said Richard, squeezing her hand, "you're going to get better. I'll arrange for the best doctors, the best treatment. You won't stay in this place any longer." Mrs. Mitchell smiled with the patience of someone who had already accepted her fate. She knew her journey was nearing its end, but she wasn't sad. Seeing her two sons together again was more than enough to give her peace. "Richie," she said, her voice growing weaker, "take care of Kevin for me. He's a good boy, hard-working like I taught you to be." "You can count on me," promised Richard, looking at Kevin with a respect that hadn't been there hours before. "I'll take care of him like you took care of me." The next few hours were a mix of nostalgia and medical urgency. Richard had immediately called his contacts to arrange for Mrs. Mitchell's transfer to Mount Sinai, one of the best hospitals in New York City. A private medical team was on their way to evaluate her condition. While they waited, Mrs. Mitchell drifted in and out of moments of lucidity. Sometimes she recognized both young men perfectly. Other times she confused them with people from the past, but always with the same love, always with the same maternal tenderness. Dr. Jonathan Miller, a renowned cardiologist and personal friend of Richard, arrived 2 hours later accompanied by a small medical team. After examining Mrs. Mitchell carefully, he called Richard and Kevin for a private conversation in the hallway. "The situation is delicate," explained Dr. Miller. "She has advanced heart failure, complicated by dementia and years of inadequate treatment. Transfer is possible, but I need to be honest, we're talking about palliative care, not a cure." The reality hit both men like a punch. Mrs. Mitchell was truly in the final moments of her life, and there wasn't much more that medicine could do beyond providing comfort and dignity. "How long?" asked Kevin, his voice choked. "Hard to say," replied Dr. Miller with professional kindness. "It could be days, it could be weeks. What's important now is to ensure she feels no pain and is surrounded by those she loves." Richard made the decision immediately. Mrs. Mitchell would be transferred to a VIP suite at Mount Sinai, where she would have all necessary assistance and, most importantly, dignity in her final moments. It was the least he could do for the woman who had been so important in his upbringing. The transfer happened that same afternoon. Mrs. Mitchell was settled into a spacious room with a garden view, equipped with all necessary medical resources, but decorated warmly, more like a luxury hotel room than a hospital environment. Kevin was impressed by the transformation. His mother, who for years had been treated as just another number in the public system, was now receiving personalized attention from a team dedicated exclusively to her well-being. "Mr. Parker," said Kevin, moved, "I can never repay this." "You don't understand," replied Richard, watching Mrs. Mitchell sleep peacefully in the new bed. "I'm the one with an unpayable debt. This woman gave me more love in the first 10 years of my life than many people receive in a lifetime. That night, both stayed at the hospital. Richard had cancelled all his appointments, and Kevin had taken time off from his other jobs. They took turns by the bedside, telling stories to Mrs. Mitchell when she was awake, watching over her sleep when she rested. During a night vigil, Kevin revealed more details about Mrs. Mitchell's life that Richard hadn't known. She had kept every Christmas card he had made for her as a child, every crayon-scribbled drawing, every photo taken during the years she had worked for the Parker family. She used to say you were proof that it's worth believing in people's goodness, shared Kevin. Even after being wronged, she never lost faith that you were special. Richard discovered that Mrs. Mitchell had followed his career from afar through magazines and newspapers. Whenever she saw an article about his business successes, she would buy the publication and keep it carefully. She had a small collection of clippings about her Richie's accomplishments. She would feel proud when she read about his business ventures, revealed Kevin. But she would also worry. She said that success without kindness was an empty success. The words echoed in Richard's mind throughout the night. Mrs. Mitchell had predicted exactly what he would become. Professionally successful but emotionally empty. She knew his heart better than he did himself. The next morning, Mrs. Mitchell woke up with more clarity than she had shown in months. She immediately recognized both men and even made some jokes about being in a palace compared to the public hospital. "Richie," she said, holding his hand, "I need to tell you something important before my memory leaves me again." Richard leaned in to listen better, prepared for whatever revelation she might have. Mrs. Mitchell took a deep breath and looked directly into his eyes with an intensity that belied her physical fragility. "You were a very special child," she began. "Always trying to protect others, always concerned when someone was sad. I know life taught you to be tough, but that kind boy is still in there." She pointed to Richard's chest with a trembling finger, touching the area of his heart. The simple action brought tears to the businessman's eyes, who felt as if she could see through all the layers of hardness he had built over the years. "Don't let the world kill that kindness," continued Mrs. Mitchell. "Money and power are important, but they aren't everything. What really matters is how you treat people who can't give you anything in return." The lesson was profound and personal. Mrs. Mitchell was summarizing all the maternal wisdom she had tried to pass on to him as a child. Now, seeing the man he had become, she was making one last appeal for him to reclaim his humanity. "Kevin is a good boy," she said, looking at her son, "raised with the same values I tried to teach you. You two can learn from each other." Mrs. Mitchell then did something neither of them expected. She took both their hands and joined them, placing Richard's hand over Kevin's and covering them with her own fragile hands. "There," she said with a satisfied smile, "now you are truly brothers, united by the love of the same mother." The symbolic gesture created a bond between Richard and Kevin that transcended social or professional matters. They were united by the same experience of maternal love, by the same frame of values, by the same pain of separation. Dr. Miller entered the room to do his morning evaluation and was surprised by the improvement in Mrs. Mitchell's condition. Although temporary, her clarity was remarkable, and he attributed this improvement to the positive environment and emotional support she was receiving. "It's impressive how love can make a difference in the clinical picture," the doctor commented to Richard in the hallway. "She's visibly stronger since you arrived." Richard spent the day organizing fundamental changes in Kevin's life. First, he would be immediately promoted from janitor to executive assistant with a corresponding salary and all benefits. Second, he would have full access to the company's health plan to take care of any medical needs. "But I don't have the qualifications to be an executive assistant," protested Kevin when he heard about the promotion. "The qualifications you will acquire," replied Richard. "What can't be taught is character, honesty, and dedication, and that you already have in abundance." Kevin felt torn between gratitude and the fear that people would think he was taking advantage of the situation. But Richard was categorical. This wasn't charity, it was recognition. The company needed people of integrity, and Kevin's integrity had been tested in the most adverse circumstances. That afternoon, Mrs. Mitchell asked to speak with Richard alone. Kevin discreetly left the room, allowing mother and adoptive son to talk in private. It was one of the most important conversations in the businessman's life. "Richie," she said, comfortably settled in the hospital bed. "I want you to know that I don't hold any grudges about what happened. Your father was a man of his time with his own limitations." Richard tried to protest, but she silenced him with a loving gesture. Mrs. Mitchell had always been wise enough to understand that holding on to resentment only poisoned the one who felt it, not the one who had caused the pain. "What matters is what we do with the lessons life gives us," she continued. "You can choose to be bitter or you can choose to be better. I know you'll choose to be better." She then told Richard about the dreams she had had about him over the years. Dreams where he was happy, surrounded by people who truly loved him, using his success to help others like Kevin. They were prophetic dreams, she believed, visions of what he could still become. "You have so much to give," she said, stroking his face. "So much love stored up inside. Don't be afraid to show that love. The world needs more people capable of truly loving." Richard cried freely, allowing himself to be vulnerable in a way he hadn't been in decades. There, in the metaphorical embrace of Mrs. Mitchell, he could be the boy he once was again, the boy she had helped shape with so much affection. "I promise," Richard said between sobs, "I promise I will honor everything you taught me. I will be a better man." Mrs. Mitchell smiled with a deep peace. She had fulfilled her maternal mission. The boy she had raised with so much love was finally ready to be the man she always knew he could be. Over the next 2 weeks, a special routine was established at the hospital. Richard spent the mornings taking care of the most urgent business matters and entire afternoons by Mrs. Mitchell's side. Kevin had organized his schedule to be present whenever possible, balancing his new position at the company with maternal care. Mrs. Mitchell had alternating moments of lucidity and confusion, but even in the most difficult moments, she seemed to recognize the presence of love around her. The nurses commented that they had never seen a patient so well cared for and surrounded by affection. Richard hired a team of therapists specialized in dementia to work with Mrs. Mitchell, not in the hope of reversing her condition, but to maximize her quality of life in her final moments. Music therapists played the old songs she loved, and an occupational therapist helped stimulate her positive memories. One afternoon, Mrs. Mitchell had a particularly special moment of lucidity. She called Richard and Kevin to her bedside and said she had a gift for them. With slow but determined movements, she pulled a small metal box from under the pillow that Kevin had brought from home. "Open it," she said, watching expectantly. Inside the box were letters, dozens of letters that Mrs. Mitchell had written over the years but never sent. Letters to Richard, telling him about Kevin's life, about the difficulties they faced, about the small joys of everyday life. Letters full of love, longing, and hope. "I always wanted to tell you about my life," she explained, "about how Kevin was growing up, about the beautiful things that were happening, but I didn't know how to find you, and I was afraid of being a bother." Richard read some of the letters right there, with Mrs. Mitchell watching his reactions. They were touching accounts of a single mother raising her son with dignity, always mentioning the affection she held for the boy she had raised before Kevin. One letter in particular moved him deeply. It was from 10 years ago, when Kevin had graduated from high school. Mrs. Mitchell described the graduation ceremony, the joy of seeing her son receive his diploma, and how she had wished Richard could have been there to share that proud moment. "I wanted you to know I managed to raise a good boy," she said. "A boy with the same values I tried to teach you when you were little." Kevin was also moved to discover that his mother had thought of Richard during all the important moments of their lives. She had never mentioned these letters to him, keeping those feelings as a private treasure. "Now you both have everything I can give," said Mrs. Mitchell, watching both men with maternal satisfaction. "Love, values, and each other. It's more than enough to build a good life." That night, Dr. Miller called Richard and Kevin for a serious talk. Mrs. Mitchell's condition had temporarily stabilized, but the tests showed the end was near. It was important for them to prepare emotionally for the farewell. "She may have a few more days, perhaps a week," the doctor explained gently. "The important thing is that you cherish every conscious moment she may still have." Richard made a decision that surprised everyone. He decided Mrs. Mitchell would not spend her last days in the hospital, no matter how comfortable it was. She deserved to be at home, surrounded by the things she loved, with the freedom to receive visitors and to live her final moments with total dignity. Kevin was worried about the logistics of caring for his mother at home, but Richard had already thought of everything. He would hire a private medical team to care for her 24 hours a day and would turn the simple house where she lived into a mini-home ICU with all the necessary resources. "She always loved that house," said Kevin, moved by the decision. Even though it was simple, she said it was her home. The transfer happened 3 days later. The two-bedroom house on the outskirts of Queens was temporarily transformed. Richard had state-of-the-art medical equipment installed, hired 2 specialized nurses to work in shifts, and even arranged for an on-call doctor 24 hours a day. But the most important things were the small details. He filled the house with fresh flowers, which Mrs. Mitchell had always loved but could rarely afford to buy. He had a sound system brought in to play the old songs she liked. He arranged for special foods that might please her palate, even with the limitations of her medical diet. Mrs. Mitchell was radiant to be home again. Even weak, she smiled upon recognizing her own furniture, her own curtains, the familiar smell of the place where she had been happy raising Kevin. "This is where I want to be," she said, settled in her own bed, which had been fitted with discreet medical equipment. "At home, with my 2 sons." Mrs. Mitchell's neighbors were impressed by the activity on the street. Medical ambulances, luxury cars, healthcare professionals coming and going. Mrs. Johnson, the closest neighbor, revealed that Mrs. Mitchell had always talked about a special boy she had raised years ago. "She said he would come back one day," Mrs. Johnson told Kevin, "that he was too special to forget about her forever." Richard stayed at a nearby hotel to always be available, but spent most of his time at the house. He discovered a welcoming community where neighbors knew and helped each other. It was a world completely different from the isolation of his penthouse on the Upper East Side. One morning, Mrs. Mitchell woke up with surprising energy. She asked to be sat in the wheelchair and taken to the backyard garden, where she grew some rose bushes that Kevin tended for her. It was there, surrounded by the flowers she loved so much, that she had her last great conversation with her 2 sons. "Do you know what the secret to happiness is?" she asked, watching the red roses beginning to bloom. Richard and Kevin exchanged glances, expecting the wisdom she always had to offer. Mrs. Mitchell smiled with the patience of someone who had learned life's most important lessons through experience and suffering. "It's knowing that the love we give always comes back to us," she said. "Maybe not from the same person, maybe not in the way we expect, but it always returns. Love is never lost." She looked at both men with infinite tenderness, as if she could see beyond appearances and look directly into the souls she had helped shape. "I love you both with the same love," she continued, "and I know you'll take care of each other when I'm no longer here. That's how love stays alive, passing from one person to another." That afternoon they did something special. Richard had hired a professional photographer to capture their last moments together. These weren't sad farewell photos, but records of a family united by love, regardless of the circumstances that had temporarily separated them. Mrs. Mitchell insisted they also bring the old photos of Richard as a child. She wanted to compare the boy from back then with the man of now, showing the photographer how her first son had grown and become an important person. "Look how beautiful he was," she said, showing a photo of 6-year-old Richard playing in the garden. "And look how he's still beautiful now, but in a different way. Kindness makes people more beautiful over time." The words touched Richard deeply. Mrs. Mitchell could still see kindness in him, even after all the years he had behaved cruelly and insensitively. Her maternal love was truly unconditional. In the last week of Mrs. Mitchell's life, she received visits from people who had marked her journey. Former employers for whom she had worked as a housekeeper came to say goodbye, bringing fond memories of her dedication and honesty. Neighbors appeared with flowers from their own gardens and words of gratitude for the times she had helped their families. She was like a mother to half the neighborhood, Mrs. Johnson commented to Richard, always ready to help, always with a word of comfort, always willing to share the little she had. Richard understood that Mrs. Mitchell had impacted many more lives than just his and Kevin's. She had been a force for good in the community, radiating love and kindness to everyone around her. It was the kind of legacy no amount of money could buy. Dr. Miller visited daily and was impressed by Mrs. Mitchell's serenity. She showed no fear or anguish in the face of her approaching departure. On the contrary, she seemed at peace, like someone who had fulfilled her mission in life. "It's rare to see someone so calm at this moment," the doctor commented to Richard. "She has truly found the inner peace that many people search for their entire lives without success." On the last night, Mrs. Mitchell called Richard and Kevin to her bedside. Her breathing was more labored, but her mind was completely lucid. She wanted to make her final requests, convey her last instructions. "Richie," she said, holding his hand with surprising strength, "promise me you'll use everything you have to do good. Money is a tool, and you can choose to use it to build or to destroy." Richard solemnly promised. He had already made important decisions about restructuring his company, creating assistance programs for employees in need, and allocating part of the profits to social projects in the community where Mrs. Mitchell lived. "Kevin," she said, turning to her son, "promise me you'll let Richie teach you about the business world. You have character, and people with character are needed in positions of responsibility," Kevin also promised. He had discovered that he liked the corporate environment, and that he had a knack for learning. Richard had become not just a boss, but a mentor, willing to teach him everything about administration and leadership. "Now both of you promise me one last thing," said Mrs. Mitchell, joining their hands once again. "Promise that you'll be a real family, that you'll take care of each other, protect each other, love each other like the brothers you are in your hearts." Both promised, and this time, they weren't just comforting words for a dying woman. It was a real commitment, sealed by the love both felt for her and the gratitude for having found each other again through her maternal love. Mrs. Mitchell died in her sleep in the early hours of the next morning, peaceful as she had lived her final days. Richard and Kevin were by her side, holding her hands, when she simply stopped breathing with a serene smile on her face. The funeral was a celebration of the life she had lived. The community church was packed with people from all walks of life who had been touched by her kindness. Richard arranged a dignified ceremony, but respected the simple wishes she had expressed. Flowers from the garden, songs she loved, and most of all, lots of love. 3 months after Mrs. Mitchell's passing, Richard and Kevin were working together at the company, now as partners. Richard had promoted Kevin to Director of Social Responsibility, recognizing his natural ability to understand the needs of the less fortunate. Together, they created the Mitchell-Parker Foundation, an organization that offered scholarships, medical assistance, and job training programs for families in need. It was a way to honor the memory of the woman who had taught them both the most important values in life. Richard's transformation was noticed by everyone who knew him. The cruel and insensitive businessman had been replaced by a leader who genuinely cared about the well-being of his employees. The company grew even more, but now with a clear social purpose. Kevin proved to be a natural executive, combining the social sensitivity inherited from his mother with an impressive learning ability. In less than a year, he was managing complex projects and earning the respect of the entire company team. The house where Mrs. Mitchell had spent her last days was turned into a community center that offered literacy classes for adults, vocational courses, and basic medical assistance. Richard made sure to keep everything exactly as she would have liked it, simple, functional, and welcoming. On the first anniversary of Mrs. Mitchell's death, Richard and Kevin organized a special mass in her memory. The church was packed once again, showing how the love she had planted continued to germinate in the community. "She would be proud to see what you've built," said Mrs. Johnson, hugging both men after the ceremony. "You managed to turn the pain of loss into strength to help others." Richard agreed, feeling Mrs. Mitchell's spiritual presence in every social project they developed. In every life they managed to transform through the foundation. In every moment of brotherhood he shared with Kevin. 5 years later, the Mitchell-Parker Foundation had become one of the largest social organizations in New York City. Thousands of families had benefited from the educational and medical assistance programs. But for Richard and Kevin, the greatest success was the fraternal relationship they had built. They had lunch together every Saturday, continuing a tradition that Mrs. Mitchell had started when Richard was a child. They talked about business, about family, about the foundation's projects, but mostly about the lessons she had left for both of them. "You know what I learned?" said Richard at one of those lunches. "That true wealth isn't in what we accumulate, but in what we manage to give to others." Kevin smiled, remembering a phrase his mother always repeated. "The hand that gives always has more than the hand that only receives." Mrs. Mitchell had planted this wisdom in both their hearts, and now they were reaping the fruits of a life dedicated to doing good. Richard's company kept growing, but now with a clear purpose. Every employee had access to comprehensive health plans, educational programs for their children, and real opportunities for professional growth. The business philosophy had completely changed. Kevin had married Jennifer, a teacher he met during one of the foundation's educational programs. They lived in a simple but comfortable house close to the community where Kevin had grown up. They had just found out they were going to be parents, and Richard would be the child's godfather. "If it's a girl, we want to name her Hope," Kevin revealed to Richard. "So my mother's name will live on in the family." Richard was moved by the idea. That child would grow up surrounded by the love that Mrs. Mitchell had taught, perpetuating the values she considered most important. It was a beautiful way to keep her memory alive. On the 10th anniversary of Mrs. Mitchell's passing, they organized a special ceremony at the community center that bore her name. Hundreds of people who had been helped by the Foundation's programs came to pay tribute to the woman who had inspired so much kindness. Richard gave an emotional speech, telling how reuniting with Mrs. Mitchell had transformed his life. He spoke about the importance of honoring those who loved us unconditionally, and about how true love never dies. It just transforms into actions that benefit others. "Mrs. Mitchell taught us that family isn't just about blood," Richard told the packed audience. "It's about love, care, and mutual commitment. Kevin and I are living proof that a mother's love can unite people regardless of their backgrounds." After the ceremony, Richard and Kevin visited Mrs. Mitchell's grave, as they had done every month since her passing. They brought fresh flowers and stayed a few minutes in silence, each with their own thoughts and gratitude. "I think she would be happy with who we've become," said Kevin, looking at the smiling photo that adorned the headstone. "I'm sure of it," replied Richard. "She always knew we were capable of being better than our circumstances." The story of Richard and Kevin became known in the New York City business community as an example of how a company can grow while maintaining strong human values. Many other business owners sought out Richard to learn about corporate social responsibility, inspired by the transformation he had brought to his own life and business. But for the two men who had been united by Mrs. Mitchell's love, the greatest reward wasn't the external recognition. It was the certainty that they were honoring the memory of the woman who had been a mother to both of them, each in their own time, but with the same maternal intensity. Little Hope was born 2 years later, a bright-eyed girl who seemed to carry the joy of the great-grandmother she never knew. Richard had become a devoted uncle, showering the child with affection and making sure she grew up knowing the story of the extraordinary woman whose name she carried. "She has the same smile," commented Kevin, watching his daughter play in the Foundation's garden. "The same sparkle in her eyes that my mother had." Richard agreed, feeling a deep emotion seeing how love can transcend generations. Mrs. Mitchell had physically departed, but her influence continued shaping lives, creating ever-widening circles of kindness and compassion. Today, 15 years after that fateful morning in the business corridor, Richard Parker and Kevin are recognized not only as successful businessmen, but as symbols of how a mother's love can completely transform a person's destiny. The company that began with Richard humiliating a janitor became a benchmark for social responsibility. The Mitchell Parker Foundation has helped over 10,000 families gain access to quality education and health care. And most importantly, two men who might have remained separated forever became a true family, united by something stronger than blood, a mother's unconditional love. End of story. Now tell me what you thought of this touching story of family and forgiveness. Do you believe a mother's love can truly transform lives in this way? Leave your opinion in the comments and share if you've also experienced a situation where someone special's affection changed your destiny. Don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other heartwarming stories like this one.